as we get into this mid stage of life, it's a very common experience to find that weight suddenly just starts piling on. As you get into your 40s and beyond, it gets harder and harder to get that weight off again. All of these scenarios are things that are driven by changes in your physiology, and the steps you're taking to try and address it aren't aligning with what your body truly needs. We talk about menopause and perimenopause as if it's this terrible thing, and it certainly can be a disruptive time in a woman's life. But I like to try and shift the perspective and look at these symptoms as almost like a superpower. They are telling you something. Your body is being really smart and it is giving you signs that it needs a little bit of help. So rather than looking at these symptoms as a burden, instead, let's listen to them and see what our body's telling us, because that's when we can make a really big difference to our quality of life. Hello and welcome to the Thriving Metabolism podcast. I'm your host, Louise Digby, and I'm a registered nutritional therapist. And my mission is all about helping women who are over 40 to optimize their health and well-being so that they can release the stubborn weight without the struggle, without all the confusion and the conflicting information, and just doing what works in the most smoothest, easiest way possible. And I want to remind you today about how important it is that we really work with our physiology as we get into our late 30s, 40s and beyond. Our bodies really do change at this time, and the way that we work on ourselves, the way that we support our health, the healthy habits that we have, they really need to align with the way that your body changes. You know, the stuff that we used to do, the stuff that we've been taught to do to manage our weight or quote unquote be healthy, these are things that actually, you know, they're not good for us at any age, but they do help to get the pounds off when we're younger, because our metabolisms are fast and our hormones are balanced, and it's easy for our body to adapt to that stressful situation of there being a lack of calories and there being a lot of energy being expended in the form of exercise, i.e. when you start eating less and exercising more, or when you start doing restrictive dieting and intense workouts. It's quite a crisis for your body, because your body thinks that there's a famine and it thinks it's under considerable stress. As I say, that's fine when you're younger, though your body can adapt, it can cope with that. But as we get into our late 30s, 40s and beyond, our bodies aren't so resilient to the impact of stress. And so it's not so good at adapting to those stresses, and the stress response is far greater. And what that means is that doing restrictive dieting or doing lots of intense exercise can really drive up your stress hormones, which has a knock-on effect on all your other hormones, your sex hormones, your thyroid hormones, your hunger hormones, your blood sugar hormones, your fat burning hormones. These all get disrupted, which ultimately results in us storing fat rather than burning it. So taking these approaches that don't align with how your physiology has changed can actually drive weight gain. And that may well be why you feel like you've been doing everything right, but you're just not seeing the results that you would expect, or the results that you used to see when you've tried these things in the past. So in this episode, I really want to give you some insights into what these changes are and really give you some actionable steps about how we adapt to these changes. Now, as we get into this mid stage of life, it's a very common experience to find that weight suddenly just starts piling on. Or you might find that you've been plodding on fine, you know, your weight has been fairly steady, and then one day suddenly the weight starts going on, but you haven't changed anything. You're not doing anything different. It's actually your body that's changing rather than you being lazy or overindulging or anything like that. Whereas some people may find that they're on a constant yo-yo with their weight, potentially dieting before holidays to get the weight off, dieting after Christmas or in the new year to get the weight off. And it may well be that over the years, you've been able to do a couple of diets a year to get your weight down, and then it gradually builds up a little bit over the year, and then you diet again to get it off, and you kind of keep your weight at a certain level by doing a diet here and there and just kind of being a little bit mindful throughout the year. But what you may find in more recent years, or as you get into your 40s and beyond, is that each time you diet, it gets harder and harder to get that weight off again, or the weight piles on or comes on over the course of the year like it always does, but it's stopped coming off. And then another scenario that I often see is that weight just gets stuck. It doesn't go on, but it doesn't come off either. And this is something I often see more around menopause, more around age 50 and beyond, whereas on the approach, it's that gradual increase that keeps going on and on and on. All of these scenarios are things that are driven by changes in your physiology, and the steps you're taking to try and address it aren't aligning with what your body truly needs. And, I think it's also important to acknowledge that along with this weight gain, there's other things that you may be noticing as well. Things like energy dips and mood changes. These are really common during this time. Changes to your menstrual cycle and these typical menopausal symptoms or perimenopausal symptoms of hot flushes, night sweats, and just general difficulty regulating your temperature. Again, changes in mood and energy levels. And it could be new things starting, like skin problems, like acne or eczema. It can almost be a little bit like going through puberty again. So there can be lots of changes that are happening. And all these changes, including the stubborn weight, they really are signs from your body that something needs to change. When all these perimenopausal symptoms, they have a very negative narrative around them. We talk about menopause and perimenopause as if it's this terrible thing, and it certainly can be a disruptive time in a woman's life. But I like to try and shift the perspective and look at these symptoms as almost like a superpower. They are telling you something. Your body is being really smart, and it is giving you signs that it needs a little bit of help. It needs a bit of support. So rather than looking at these symptoms as a burden and something that we need to suppress, instead, let's listen to them and see what our body's telling us about what it needs, because that's when we can make a really big difference to our quality of life and how we feel and the progress that we see. Now, two of the key hormonal players during these transitional times are estrogen and progesterone. And what happens is your estrogen level will fluctuate, but it will generally decline over time. It might go a little bit high at first, but it will gradually decline. Potentially from the age of 35, it may be more like 40 where you start to see changes, but the shift starts happening from around the mid-30s all the way up to 50. So it's a long, very, very gradual transition where your estrogen gradually starts to drop. Your progesterone also drops along with your estrogen. Where there can be problems and symptoms occurring can be either when the hormones are not dropping at the same rate. So the progesterone often drops a lot quicker. So you end up with what's called estrogen dominance, which is where your estrogen isn't necessarily high, but your progesterone is lower than it should be in relation to estrogen. So you can end up with a disparity between the two, which gives you estrogen dominant symptoms. And your estrogen is kind of what we call the diva hormone. So it's when we have it and it's not in alignment with progesterone, then we can experience more PMS, more mood swings, heavy bleeding, and a lot of these, a lot of the bothersome symptoms, basically. Progesterone is a very calming hormone. So when levels drop rapidly and your estrogen isn't dropping as quickly, then we can be more prone to symptoms like anxiety, and we can find it more difficult to regulate our stress hormones. And then that can feed into other problems like stubborn weight and also worsening hormonal symptoms or thyroid issues because of the way that it's really driving our stress hormones. Now, estrogen plays a really big role in our fat distribution on our body. And estrogen, when it's kind of at normal or pre-menopausal levels, estrogen makes it more likely that we're going to carry our fat around our hips, around our bums, thighs, arms. But as it drops, we become more prone to carrying weight around our middle. And a lot of women find that they do lose that hourglass shape, and they basically, because they lose their waist, where they start to put on more weight around the middle, which is often one of the things that we struggle with because we often associate that shape with our femininity, and we can start to really feel like we're losing that femininity around that time. And I know for so many women that I work with, that is one of the things that bothers them the most, is just having that belly fat or that weight around the middle. Now, estrogen is something that, yes, it's totally natural for it to decline, but when it declines too rapidly or it declines too much, that can be when the weight goes on around the middle and it becomes incredibly stubborn. And there's plenty that we can do to help prevent that decline of estrogen being quite so rapid or quite so extreme, to help prevent that really stubborn belly fat that comes with it. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But I also want to touch on the other things that estrogen does for us. Estrogen is very protective of our bone health. And what we know is that after menopause, we're more likely to develop bone density issues and problems like osteoporosis, because we're not getting that protection from estrogen for our bones anymore. Estrogen is also very brain protective, and we know that what correlates with estrogen dropping can be inflammation of the brain. So it's important for our overall health to try and support our estrogen levels, not just for our weight management. It really is about true health optimization. Now, I mentioned earlier that progesterone also has quite an impact on us and can make us feel more anxious and can make estrogen become almost stronger. And another thing that happens with progesterone levels declining is that it can unfortunately impact our metabolism, slowing it down, but also it can make us more likely to have water retention. And this is another really common symptom that I see. And actually, for many of the ladies that I work with, one of the things that they get most excited about is when they lose that water retention and they see the puffiness and the bloat go from their face, and they see some definition come back to their jaw lines and around their neck, and they also can fit their rings back on because they're losing the water retention from their hands. They get more definition in their ankles. So it's really interesting that, not all of this weight gain is fat. A lot of it can be water retention. And we often think about getting water retention if we've had something particularly carby. For me, I know that if I've had a pizza or something, then I feel really bloated and like I'm retaining water. Whereas this, what we're talking about here, is more to do with the way that the hormones are causing water retention and essentially driving inflammation in the body, which causes you to hold on to water in some circumstances. Now, one of the ways in which estrogen can drive weight gain is by driving insulin resistance. Now, as estrogen levels drop, we're more likely to develop insulin resistance. So insulin resistance is where we become less sensitive to the effects of insulin. So insulin is a hormone that essentially helps to control the levels of sugars in the blood, and it does that by sweeping the sugars away into our cells. We then use that sugar for energy. If we don't need that sugar at that time, then we actually store it away as fat. So insulin is essentially our fat storage hormone. Now, insulin is it communicates with our cells to basically make them open up the gates and allow that sugar to come in. But when we develop insulin resistance, our cells don't listen to insulin. We have to produce more and more of it to have the same effect. And that is not good when we are trying to lose weight, because remember, insulin is our fat storage hormone. So the more we produce, the harder it's going to be to get into fat burning mode, which is something that can only happen when our blood sugars drop to a certain level. Now, we don't want our blood sugars to drop too low, but we want them to be in that happy range so that we are able to get into fat burning. And when we're insulin resistant and we've got loads of insulin floating around because our cells aren't accepting that sugar into our cells anymore, we can't get into fat burning mode. So estrogen is something that when it drops, we're much more likely to develop insulin resistance. And we have to be more careful about the way that we eat and the things that can drive up blood sugars, because it's not just food. We have to be more careful about these things in order to regulate our insulin levels better. So again, that's another reason why the things that used to work for you no longer do. And a really good example of this is diets like Slimming World. These are typically diets that are very much focused on low calorie, and they tend to be quite carb heavy. There can be a lot of kind of free foods like pasta and low fat yogurt, which tends to be very high in sugar. And a lot of the foods that you might base your diet around can be very carby and very sweet. And although you may well be in a calorie deficit when you stay within your sins or points, if we're talking about Weight Watchers, you will not be able to get in fat burning mode because all these sugars and carbohydrates are keeping your blood sugars elevated. They're driving insulin resistance and preventing you from getting into fat burning mode, even when you're in a calorie deficit. And that is a point that I want to emphasize so much. We could be in a calorie deficit all day long, every day, but if your hormones are out of balance because essentially your insulin level is too high, then you are not going to be able to get into fat burning mode. And another thing that really plays into this is cortisol. Cortisol is our stress hormone, one of our stress hormones. And if you remember, I said earlier that we become much less resilient to the impacts of stress as we get into this mid stage of life. And it's all to do with how the ovaries shut down and produce fewer sex hormones. And then your adrenal glands, which are your stress glands, they actually take over much of the production of your sex hormones. So your adrenals now have two jobs. They now need to produce not only your stress hormones, but your sex hormones as well. And it's really important for your body that if it's under stress, if it's in danger, if there's a famine, it's much more important for your body to be able to respond to that stress than it is to be able to reproduce. So your body will always prioritize making stress hormones over sex hormones. And they're all made from the same raw materials, the same nutrients and proteins and fats. So when we're under stress, we produce fewer sex hormones, essentially, especially after this midlife stage and during this perimenopausal transition. And what that means is that stress will drive down those sex hormones even more, which drives up that insulin resistance even more and makes it even more difficult for us to lose weight. So stress further drives that really stubborn belly fat and that change in body composition. So again, you could be in a calorie deficit all day long, but if you're under stress, then that is going to be driving insulin resistance and that stubborn weight. Now, it's also really important for me to mention the gut microbiome and gut health generally, because it's such an important player in our metabolisms and our overall health. And as we go into this midlife stage, with all the changes that are happening in the body, but also just the stuff that typically is happening for you in this time of life where you tend to be more stressed, more busy, less sleep because of all the demands that you have from children and aging parents and full-time jobs and financial decisions and bereavements and all the stresses that are going on. These things impact your gut microbiome. And the gut microbiome is very involved in the way that we regulate our hormones. It can, if it's imbalanced, it can very much drive inflammation. It can drive up toxic load. Where there's a very strong gut-brain connection, and so it can impact our moods and our food choices and our cravings. And essentially, it can impact your health and weight loss journey in pretty much every way you can imagine, in terms of physiological changes and how it drives weight gain, but also, your mindset and your mental well-being, which is absolutely key for us to make changes that are consistent and we're going to be able to keep going with in the long term. So gut health is absolutely key. We can absolutely not ignore gut health when it comes to optimizing our health and hormones and metabolism. Now, one of the ways in which the microbiome is involved in our metabolisms, and there are so many ways, but as we've been talking about hormones a lot, I thought I'd pick out this one. We obviously absorb all our nutrients through the gut, everything that we eat. In order to be able to make the most of that, we have to be able to digest it and absorb it. And you always hear the saying, you are what you eat, but the truth of it is that you actually are what you digest and absorb. It's not quite so catchy, but it's far more accurate, because you could be eating the best diet, but if you're not digesting and absorbing it properly, you're going to be getting limited benefit from that. So we digest and absorb our nutrients, and those are essential for us to be able to actually make our hormones in the first place. So if we've got issues with digestion and absorption, that's going to have a knock-on effect on the balance of our hormones. Now, there's lots of other factors involved in our hormones being balanced, from how healthy our cells are and inflammation and how we're detoxing them. But just keeping things linked to the gut, really at the beginning of the hormone process, we have to absorb our nutrients. And then right at the end of the whole flow of what happens with our hormones, we have to eliminate them. And then we eliminate them via the gut. And what happens is your liver removes them from the blood and processes them. And then through the bile, it excretes them into the digestive tract. The digestive tract then basically eliminates them when you have a bowel movement. But where this can go wrong is if there are imbalances in the gut bacteria, then you can actually end up reabsorbing some of those processed hormones, which we don't want, because they are going to cause disruption to the balance of hormones in our system. We can also be reabsorbing toxins. This can happen if we have imbalances in the microbiome. Also, if we have leaky gut or intestinal hyperpermeability, which is where the gut lining isn't as healthy as it should be. And also, if we're just not having a bowel movement regularly, 1 to 2 times a day is ideally what we should be having. We're not having that, then everything's moving slower and spending longer in the digestive tract. So it's going to be more likely that you're going to be reabsorbing these hormones that should be being eliminated. So making sure that we are chewing our food properly. It's so boring, it's so basic, but honestly, time and time again, it is one of the biggest things that makes an impact to my clients' health. If we just eat slower, chew our food thoroughly, and try to pay attention to our meals rather than being distracted by TV or our phones or whatever else, or definitely not eating on the go, trying to stop and sit down and eat. These are things that make a huge difference to just how well processed the food is by our mouth before it reaches the stomach. But also chewing and thinking about our food helps to stimulate the digestive juices, your enzymes, your bile, and your stomach acid. And this will help us to break down the food better and absorb it better as well. So chewing your food thoroughly is one of the most important things that you can do. It is the easiest thing that you can do because you can start doing it from your next meal. So please do that. And even if you just did that and did it consistently, you would see a difference in your digestion and your overall well-being. Now, in terms of making sure that you have a regular bowel movement, we want to ensure that we're keeping our bodies moving regularly, we're drinking plenty of water, and we're, of course, having plenty of fiber in the diet. And that might mean having a variety of vegetables during the day, a little bit of fruit, having some nuts and seeds, incorporating some beans and pulses. And having a variety like that should make a significant difference. And if you're still struggling, one of the things that can make a really big difference is adding some ground flax seeds into your diet. A tablespoon or two each day, add it to your granola or add it to whatever you want really. And it will really help because it's rich in fiber, but also when it gets wet, it creates like a gelatinous substance, a sort of gel that basically helps to lubricate the intestines and make it easy for you to have a bowel movement. But also, flax seeds are amazing for supporting hormones because they actually help to bind to toxins and hormones in the gut and carry them out of the gut when you have a bowel movement. And they also have some phytoestrogens, which are supportive of hormonal balance. So that is a great addition. Now, I spoke about stress earlier and how it can disrupt your hormones, but it's also really important to acknowledge that when we're stressed, we're much more likely to comfort eat. We're more likely to opt for sugary, carby things that can disrupt our blood sugars. And part of the reason why we're more likely to choose those things is because your blood sugars are already disrupted from the stress. So we can end up with peaks and troughs in our blood sugars when we are under a lot of stress. But also when we're stressed, we're more likely to have disrupted sleep. And then that has a knock-on effect on our energy and our cravings. And we're much more likely again to reach for those easy, convenient, sweeter, carbier foods, partly because we're going to be craving that energy boost that we get from those foods, but also because when we're tired, we're less likely to make good food choices. We're going to have less motivation, willpower. It's going to be more difficult for us to kind of tune in to our goals and what's really important to us. And we're just going to be focusing on getting through the day. So really making sure that we prioritize stress management as well as good quality sleep, again, can make such a huge difference to your well-being and the overall progress that you see. And again, if sleep is disrupted, our hunger hormones are going to be disrupted. We're going to be more inflamed. Our other hormones are going to be disrupted too. So it just throws everything out of balance. And so often when I've been working with someone who's making good progress and then suddenly the progress stops, so often find that it's a disruption to their sleep for whatever reason. Maybe it's a child or a work project or something like that. So often a change in their sleep pattern that correlates with the change in progress. And when they focus their attention back on getting good quality sleep, things progress again without changing anything food-wise or exercise-wise. Because remember, it's got nothing to do with the amount of calories you're eating or burning in terms of the progress that you're making. So making sure that you're taking steps to support these areas can be things like practicing mindfulness, which can be just stopping, breathing, listening to the sounds around you, being mindful of being around you and basically being in the present moment rather than always multitasking and kind of doing one thing with your hands and something else entirely in your mind. For example, that might be you're doing the washing up, but you're thinking about your meal plan for next week. And whilst that might seem like a really efficient way to work because you're multitasking, actually, always doing that can mean that we're never really in that present moment. And that can be very stressful for our bodies. And it doesn't mean that we should never do that, but actually just taking some moments in the day where we practice being mindful. And maybe if we're doing the washing up, we're thinking about how the warm water feels on our hands and we're listening to the splash of the water and that sort of thing. It doesn't have to be anything dramatic. We don't have to be doing anything super time consuming. It could just be that we take these moments in the day where we practice being there in the moment. Now, something else that's so important for our well-being is our social connections. And I think in today's day and age, we are more connected than ever to people. People have access to our lives through social media and to being able to message us anytime. And I actually think that can have a really negative effect on our well-being, being constantly available and never really having meaningful connections with people. So taking a step to try and make some more regular, meaningful connections with people can be so, so good for our well-being. There's been so many studies on social isolation and loneliness now to show how that impacts our stress levels, and scheduling in some time, whether that's to call a friend or to meet up with someone for a coffee, or whether it's just, saying hello to people when you're out for a walk or something like that, having that human connection is absolutely critical for our well-being. So taking steps to weave that into our lives is highly, highly recommended. And then to talk a little bit more about sleep specifically and what we can do to optimize our sleep, making sure that we have a consistent sleep schedule is really, really helpful. Trying to get to bed at the same time and trying to get up at the same time every day has a really big impact on our energy levels, because that routine, it really helps our body and our hormone regulation and that circadian rhythm. Our body knows when it's expecting us to wake up. So we've already got that surge in cortisol, which is a good thing in the morning. We've already got that surge of cortisol happening to give us that lift for starting our day. And it also means that our hormones are doing what they need to do. Melatonin is being produced so that we can wind down and get to sleep when we want to. And it all leads to better sleep quality, but also better energy levels through the day. And both those things are very, very good things when we're trying to optimize our health and eat better and stay active and do all these healthy habits that we're trying to do consistently. I know for me, it makes a huge difference when I have a consistent wake and sleep schedule. I recently have got out of the habit of doing that, fallen into some really not helpful habits in terms of bedtimes and wake times. And it really impacted not only my productivity and energy levels and weight, but also just my mental health and, how much work I get done and so many things, how I feel in my body, feeling achy and stiff. And just getting that sorted recently, getting back into getting up at 7, trying to get to bed by 11, and doing things like reading instead of scrolling. Oh my God, the difference it has made to how I feel in myself is just unreal. So little things, getting routines into place can make a really big difference. And I do really, really encourage you to try and step away from the screens in the evening. Try and pick up a book and read, or whatever works for you in terms of unwinding, but being a little bit less dependent on our phones and our screens to zone out and tune out, because it doesn't really help us relax in the way that we feel like it does. I think it just helps us to zone out and tune out and go somewhere else entirely. Whereas if we take a more active role in trying to wind down at the end of the day, in terms of doing a mindfulness practice or reading or doing some stretching, some deep breathing, maybe it's your skincare routine or whatever it might be, doing something kind of more quote unquote active is something that is going to help you to send a signal to your body that it's time for bed. When we have these habits in place and we consistently do them, and your body knows that when you start washing your face and cleaning your teeth, or when you get changed or you start reading a book, these are all signals to our body that it's time to start winding down and go to sleep. And you'll find that you get to sleep much quicker and you stay asleep much better by having these routines in place. And not only that, but you'll feel much more energized in the morning. And all of that leads to better health and better weight loss results. So I understand how overwhelming this all is. I know that was a lot of information, and you might be thinking, how do I even start? But the good news is that I've anticipated this. And I'm just thinking about one of my clients recently who felt really lost amid all the details about her body and how to achieve sustainable weight loss. And she and so many of us are just inundated with advice about how to eat and, what to do. And, really trying to figure out what worked for her was just really causing overwhelm. And, the sheer amount of volume of information was just leaving her really discouraged and confused. Does that sound familiar to you? Well, that's exactly why I am so passionate about creating content that builds a solid foundation for your sustainable weight loss journey. And I truly understand that it's a lot to go through. There's a lot to think about, and it really can be just so difficult to get your head in the right place and know how to move forwards. Life can get hectic, and it's really easy to feel like there's just too much to manage. That is why I've compiled all of the essential tools and insights that you need to kickstart your weight loss journey without the confusion and the overwhelm. And I've done that in my ebook, which is called Reignite Your Metabolism, a 3-step weight loss guide for women over 40. And I've really distilled the knowledge from my 89 podcast episodes into one comprehensive resource. You're going to find practical guidance and tests that you can do to understand your body better. And this empowerment really allows you to take charge of your health and your work towards achieving your dream body. We'll guide you step by step, ensuring that you feel supported throughout your journey. And together, we're going to navigate this path to wellness. And here's something to make your journey even more exciting. As a special thank you for sticking with me until the end of this episode, I want to offer you an exclusive 50% off discount on my ebook. Just use the code NOW40 at the checkout. I am committed to making this journey not only achievable, but also enjoyable, because you absolutely deserve boundless energy and a vibrant life and the body that you've always wanted. So let's take this step together. Click the link in the show notes or visit louisedigby.com/ebook40 right now. I can't wait to hear about your success story next. Your journey is important, and I'm excited to celebrate every milestone with you. Thank you so much for joining me today. And if you've enjoyed this episode, then please do head over to iTunes, leave a quick review, and let me know how this has helped you. And if you follow along on YouTube, then make sure you hit like and subscribe. If you listen on a podcast platform, please make sure you hit follow. It really does make a difference to us in helping to get the message out there. Thanks again. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next one.